session. Before we begin, I want to set out a few points. A plenary meeting held by video conference in accordance with the standing orders of the Welsh Parliament constitutes Senedd proceedings for the purposes of the Government of Wales Act 2006. Some of the provisions of Standing Order 34 will apply for today's plenary meeting, and these are noted on your agenda. And I would remind members that standing orders relating to order in plenary meetings apply to this meeting. The first item is questions to the First Minister, and the first question is from Vicky Howells.
Diolch, Llywydd. What is the Welsh Government doing to improve access to emergency mental health care?
Llywydd, on the 21st of December, the Minister for Mental Health, Eluned Morgan, published Beyond the Call, the Welsh Government review of urgent access to mental health services. Cabinet agreement has since been secured to implementation of the report's recommendations across the range of ministerial responsibilities.
Thank you, First Minister, for that answer. I'm particularly concerned about our children and young people accessing the appropriate care in terms of the pressures placed on them during the pandemic. So it's welcome that the Welsh Government has prioritised them with the recent £9.4 million for the Schools in Reach pilot and CAMS. However, the pandemic has also highlighted the all too real health inequalities faced by far too many communities across Wales, including in my own constituency of Cynon Valley. How is the Welsh Government built tackling this into service provision?
Well, I thank Vicky Howells for that supplementary question. It gives me an opportunity, hearing her mention health inequalities, to remind colleagues here that this week is the 50th anniversary of Dr. Julian Tudor-Hart's paper in the Lancet on the inverse care law, a paper that has had a genuinely global impact far beyond Wales. It was sent to me, Llywydd, again this week by our former colleague, Dr. Brian Gibbons, reminding me of the continued relevance of that 50-year-old seminal piece of work. And of course, Vicky Howells is right, as was Dr. Gibbons, that the pandemic has exposed those fault lines in our society all over again. And in emergency mental health services, Llywydd, we know that those people who have the least access to mainstream services often have to gain and obtain health services through emergency routes. It's why the review, the Beyond the Call review, was so important, to make sure that those routes are as clear and as easy as possible for people to read. Members who've had a chance to have a look at it will know that it tracks the 950 calls every day that come into emergency and out of normal hours services across Wales from people with a mental health need of one sort or another. Looks to see what happens to those people. No one needs 3 out of 10 of them, Llywydd, turn out to need simply an NHS response. There are other aspects of their lives that need attention as well. So the reports focus on collaboration, on timeliness, on crisis planning for people who are known to have a pre-existing condition, on a missing person protocol, particularly important for young people, as Vicky Howells focused on in her supplementary question, and a single point of entry to help those who need help to get it in a crisis. And I'm very pleased to say that we've now got pilots, 111 pilots in Swansea Bay, Howell Dda and in Iron Bevan Health Boards, all designed to put that aspect of the report into practice so that we can do better in the way that Vicky Howells asked in her original question, to make sure that emergency mental health care is available to people at that point of need.
David Melding.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, do you agree with me that priority continues to needs to be given to capital investment in modern acute facilities? It's still the case that some are old-fashioned, inappropriate, too large adolescents, for instance, in adult facilities, and anyone suffering acute mental distress and or psychosis can find their trauma is increased by grossly inappropriate facilities, sometimes including being held in prison cells whilst placements are sought. This is unacceptable in the modern age.
Well, so I do absolutely agree with David Melding that people should get the help they need in the right setting. It's completely unacceptable that someone who has primarily a mental health need or condition should end up in a criminal justice context. I know that David Melding will be pleased that one of the beyond the call recommendations that has been implemented is that we should have conveyance pilots, that people who are in acute mental distress should not be taken to where they can get help in the back of a police car. And we have 3 of those pilots going on at the moment with St John Cymru in Swansea Bay, Cwm Taf Morgannwg, and here in Cardiff and the Vale. And it's precisely in order to address the sorts of circumstances that David Melding has referenced, that those people should get the help they need in a way that is sensitive to the distress that they are experiencing, and not in places or by means that add to that distress. And that will need further investment. Very pleased to say that we still hope that the Tonna inpatient perinatal mental health service will open to patients in April of this year, and that will be in physical conditions that meet the standards of the 21st century.
Mandy Jones.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, I've raised this matter of the mental health effects of the lockdown policy since it was evident that the 3 weeks to flatten the curve was nothing of the sort. We won't know the full effect of lockdown policy in terms of suicides, mental health crises, cancers and waiting times for a long time yet. That said, your government seems to be investing heavily in mental health services with 10 million additional funding to deal with the effects of lockdown. Can you tell the Chamber how this sum was calculated, please, and how specifically it will benefit those unfortunate enough to need access to emergency mental health services? Thank you.
Well, thank the member for her question. Of course, we have recognised throughout that there is more than one sort of harm that comes from coronavirus, and the impact on people's mental health and well-being is certainly one of the things to which we have always attempted to pay close attention. I know the member will be pleased that the British Medical Journal recently reported on evidence that there has not been a rise in suicide rates in the early part of the pandemic. But I agree with what Mandy Jones said, that these are early days and that the impact of the pandemic will go on for many months and longer than that to come. But it was at least encouraging that the worst feared impacts in those early days did not appear to have materialised. The additional investment in mental health is actually £43 million in the draft budget. That comes on top of the fact that mental health is the single largest budget line within the health service here in Wales. That £43 million has to do an awful lot. So of course, it has to strengthen services in the community. It has to make sure that young people do not, as David Melding alluded, end up in age-inappropriate settings. If they need inpatient treatment, it has to make sure that we go on improving services for people with dementia and the need for mental health services later on in life. But it will have been calculated in the normal ways in partnership with the health service, the third sector, and those who do so much to help provide services for people in Wales with a mental health condition.
Question 2, Russell George.
Diolch, Llywydd. Will the First Minister make a statement on the reopening of schools?
Llywydd, opening up education remains the Welsh Government's main priority. Our youngest learners started to return to schools this week. As announced on Friday, if the public health situation continues to improve, more children will return to their classrooms from March the 15th in a safe and flexible way.
Thank you, First Minister, for your answer. I certainly welcome that schools have reopened as of yesterday for younger children. A concern raised with me is that school uniforms seem to be classed as non-essential items and are unable to be purchased. Shoe shops are closed, meaning that children cannot be measured to get approximate sized shoes. So what advice can you provide to parents in supporting them to obtain school uniforms and shoes before their children return to school? And what consideration has been given to relax the wearing of school uniforms in schools, given the fact that children grow out of clothes and shoes so quickly and schools are closed for such long periods of time?
Well, so thank Russell George for those points, which are all points which I think are absolutely right ones to raise in this context. And the instruction of the Welsh Government to schools is that they must take a flexible approach to uniforms in these extraordinary periods. No child should be being sent home from school in Wales because they're unable to obtain the uniform in the extraordinary circumstances of recent weeks. And I'm sure that schools will exercise good sense in the way that they approach this matter. We're in discussions with the retail sector to see if there's anything we can do to help meet emergency needs when children don't have shoes in the way that the member explained. And I know that schools themselves will look to assist where there are genuine difficulties of that sort. The system just needs to react to the circumstances in a way that shows some flexibility and simple good sense in order to make sure that families do not find themselves additionally facing additional difficulties on the journey back into education.
Questions now from the party leaders. Leader of the Conservatives, Andrew Davies.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, in response to Russell George's question, you said that education and reopening of education was your #1 priority, and I think we'd all subscribe to that. But regrettably, ministers have confirmed that some year groups going back to school will not return to school until after the Easter break. So if you're in year 7, 8, 9 or 10, you will not be returning until after the Easter break under the current conditions that your government has outlined. How can you allow, if there's any headroom going through the month of March, for school children to remain out of school and be opening up other parts of the economy by lifting the restrictions? Has education slipped down your priority list? Or if it is still your #1 priority, will you make sure that any headroom that develops through the month of March sees school children return across all year groups in Wales?
Well, so with returning children and young people to face-to-face learning is the top priority of this government, but we will do so in a way that is consistent with the science and the advice that we have. Members here will have seen the TAC report published on the 5th of February, which set out that advice and which echoes the advice that has been provided by SAGE. And that advice is simple, that if we were to return all children to school on a single day in Wales, that would raise the R number in Wales between 10 and 50%. We are therefore very specifically recommended not to do that. What we are recommended to do is to return children to school in tranches, to pause between those tranches so that we can properly gather the evidence of the impact of that return upon the circulation of the virus here in Wales. So it is not as simple as saying, if you have the headroom, return all children to school, because to do so in that way would involve very significant risks of its own. We will return the foundation phase this week. We will pause and we will review the evidence that emerges from that return. Provided the evidence is positive, all primary age children will return to school on the 15th of March together with examination students in secondary school. We will then pause, as the scientific advice requires us to do, to review the impact of that. And provided that goes well, then we will return other students to school where we want them to be. If in the meantime that means we are able to offer any further easements in other areas to allow our economy or our daily lives to begin the journey back to normality, then of course we would want to do that.
First Minister, it is a matter of regret that certain cohorts of children will not be going back to school till after Easter, and that is the choice that you are taking, despite saying it is your #1 priority to get school children back to face-to-face learning as quickly as possible. I was very specific in the way I asked the question about using the headroom that is available to the month of March to allow this to happen in a more timely manner. Regrettably, you chose not to engage with that. And it is a fact that the government will be leaving a significant cohort of pupils out of school, and that is a choice the government is taking. If we look at choices and priorities, the Federation of Small Businesses have talked about radio silence coming from the government today when it comes to interacting with business over the conditions that the government would expect to see before opening up waves of the economy. It is unfortunate that such a substantial business organisation has referred to radio silence coming from Welsh Government and a lack of a roadmap being put in place so business can understand what would be expected of them from the government before they reopen. So can you use this plenary opportunity to put on the record what conditions you expect to be in place before parts of the economy are reopened and business can plan accordingly? And will you confirm whether you will be bringing forward a roadmap that has clear gateways for the conditions to travel through so that businesses know when they will be able to reopen and begin trading? Because that would be the best recovery any business can expect to have by trading under normal conditions.
Well, Llywyd, let me just help the member a second time in relation to schools. We will return students to schools as fast as it is safe to do so. The advice we have is it would not be safe to do what he is suggesting. Now, if it is the policy of the Conservative Party in Wales to return children to conditions that are not safe for them or for their staff, then let him say so. This government will not do that. We will follow the science, whatever happens elsewhere. And the science is you must return children in tranches and you must pause between each one. I set out the roadmap of the Welsh Government in December. We updated it again on Friday of last week. I hope the members had a chance to consider that. He wouldn't need to ask me for one if he had taken the trouble to do so. That sets out the way in which we will lift the restrictions that currently are necessary for businesses and in our personal lives. It's clear from what he said today that businesses in Wales would know where they were if he were to be in charge, because they wouldn't be going back at all, because it would be clear that he wouldn't be able to do that and do what he has just said in relation to education. The Welsh Government will not follow his advice on that. If we are in a position to begin the reopening of businesses in Wales earlier than he would be able to do so, then that is what we will do. We will do it in partnership, of course, with business organisations, as we always do, and we will be discussing those possibilities with them during the 3 weeks that we now have before the next review has to conclude.
Well, First Minister, you've taken your usual condescending tone, but you might be the professor in the bay, but you're the professor without a plan out of lockdown, and that's a real problem for the economy and for school children's the length and breadth of Wales. But what you can do with the powers that are available to you is put some support in for businesses by extending the business rate relief scheme. Will you, at least in this third question, engage positively and commit today to extending the business rate relief scheme that has been extended in other parts of the UK and would be a relief to many businesses facing business rate demands? Because in the absence of any coherent plan to bring the economy out of lockdown, and with the evidence provided by the Federation of Small Businesses that there's radio silence coming from the Welsh Government, try and pull one lever at least to help the economy regain its confidence.
Well, about 64,000 businesses in Wales have already received rate relief as a result of the decisions of this Welsh Government. I understand how important that is to businesses, but we will wait until Wednesday of next week, the 3rd of March, to see the Chancellor's budget so that we are clear about how much money we have as a government for all the different purposes that we have to discharge in the next financial year. If the Chancellor makes provision for rate relief, then we will be able to provide rate relief here in Wales. But I'm not prepared to commit to using the money we have next year until I am clear the quantum of funding that will be available, not just for businesses, but to support the health service during this pandemic, to support local authorities in the work that they do to make sure that third sector organisations, the arts, support all those many things that we have to attend to. Until I know how much money is available to the Welsh Government next year, I'm not prepared to come to a conclusion on any one aspect of it. To do so would be simply irresponsible. Now, once we know on Wednesday of next week whether Wales is to have money taken away from us next year again, as we have on so many occasions during the 10 years that his government has imposed austerity on Wales, or whether we have money that we need to attend to the calls of businesses and others. Once we know, this government will make allocations to those key sectors during the month of March. I hope very much that we will be in a position to do as the leader of the Conservatives here has suggested, and to offer further help to businesses in Wales. But we won't be in a position to do that until we know what his government in Westminster has got in store for us.
Arweinydd Plaid Cymru, Adam Price.
First Minister, how many care workers in Wales currently receive less than the real living wage?
Well, I'm quite sure the member will be able to give me an answer to that question. I'm well aware that publicly provided social care in most parts of Wales does provide at the real living wage, and in the private sector, where most residential care is provided, there are employers who are yet to do so. We are using our grant in aid to the sector to encourage the provision of the real living wage, and we hope that we will be able to make significant progress as a result of the additional money that we provide.
According to the Resolution Foundation, First Minister, more than half of all care workers in Wales currently receive less than the real living wage. Poverty wages, in other words. That was unacceptable before the pandemic, and it's certainly unacceptable now. And that's not just my view, it's also the view expressed recently by your party's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, who's called for the government in England to commit to a care worker's minimum wage of £10 an hour. Are you prepared to match that commitment to a £10 an hour minimum wage for all care workers here in Wales?
Well, I certainly agree with members that it's unacceptable that people who have done so much and at the front line during the pandemic are not paid at a level that recognises the value and importance of the work that they do. Of course, if my party at Westminster succeeds in persuading the UK government to make such a payment, there will be money that will come to Wales to allow us to fund such a commitment. But I always have to ask myself where the money will come from week by week. He asks me to spend money that he hasn't got and I haven't got. And I'm keeping a running total of his many, many unfunded commitments that he constantly tries to press upon me. The Welsh Government is using money we have in the way that would promote the payment of the real living wage in the social care sector. That is a business investment, in my view, for those private organisations that fail to do so at the moment. And in the money that we provide, we are doing everything we can to make sure that that is made their priority. If more money comes our way, we'll be able to do even more.
First Minister, the Scottish Government has already committed last year to ensuring that all care workers in Scotland receive the real living wage. Why aren't you prepared to make that commitment here in Wales? The unions are calling for it. The care sector is calling for it. The Berwyn Foundation is calling for it. Yes, you're absolutely right. It would be a priority to deliver for a Plaid Cymru government. The Labour Party is committed to supporting it in England and Scotland. They just put an amendment there this week to go further than the current commitment of the Scottish Government. Why won't you commit to doing it as a government, to making the same commitment where you have the power to make such a difference to tens of thousands of care workers' lives and the people that depend upon them?
So the only priority the leader of Plaid Cymru has is to make fine-sounding speeches in which he promises anybody that he will be able to solve their problem. So this is a priority for him. Well, that's good to know. Last week, it was a priority with him to spend money on free school meals. The week before that, it was a priority with him to provide childcare for all families, for every child with a child above the age of 1. The week before that, it was to spend £6 billion on investment that he hasn't got. Priorities, Llywydd, mean not just simply saying things that he thinks people will want to hear. It means having to make decisions that match the harsh realities of budgets with the ambitions that we have. This government has a real ambition to improve conditions in the social care workforce. It's why we decided that it would be a registered profession. We have a real ambition to make sure that people are properly paid in it, and we will find the money to match our priorities. Simply adding week after week to totally uncosted wish lists, which is all he ever has to offer me. It really is a remarkable performance of voodoo economics that he conjures up here on a weekly basis, and he's done it again today.
Question 3, Bethan Syed.
What specific actions has the Welsh Government taken to lessen the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women in the workplace?
So to provide just 2 specific actions, the Working Wales service has been used by over 6,500 women across Wales during lockdown, and the Business Startup Grant has attracted 60% of its applications from women. All of this and more is drawn together in today's publication of our Economic Resilience and Construction Mission.
Thank you for the response, and we know that women have been sadly disproportionately affected by the pandemic, women making up 80% of childcare, care and leisure services, 75% administrative and secretarial, 60% working in the sales and customer services, sectors that have been hit hard. We've just talked about childcare, but I think one of the most essential changes that you could make would be that women seeking employment and or training have access to childcare, as well as those who are in the current scheme, so that they can feel empowered to go out to work again. We are awaiting judgment as to whether the UK government have acted illegally in reducing the self-employment income support scheme payments for women who have taken maternity leave. I would like to know here today whether Welsh Government have taken any action to support new mothers in Wales who will have taken an unfair financial hit by this failure, and what risks were flagged in your Build Back Better scheme. As we know, school closures have affected women doing a lot of the childcare and the schooling. How will Welsh Government ensure that Wales will not only build back better, but build back equal?
Well, so let me begin by agreeing with the sentiments that Bethan Syed expressed in the very end of her supplementary question, because I never myself use the mantra build back better. I always say build back fairer, because if it isn't fairer, it's not going to be better. And she's right to point out the disproportionate impact that the last 12 months has had on women in Wales, as it has on young people, as it has on people from BAME communities. The Welsh Government lobbies the UK Government all the time when it takes actions of which we disapprove and which do not fit with our wish to create a more equal Wales, as the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act requires us to do. When we publish our spending decisions and the decisions that we have made during lockdown, we accompany them with an equality impact assessment, because we try to see all those decisions through the lens of the equality impact that those decisions have on people. We publish those equality impacts alongside the decisions that we make. And you know, I'm very glad indeed that we have a fertile debate here in Wales all the time about how we can do more and do better to make sure that the decisions that we make during the pandemic, and especially as we come out of it, that those decisions are focused on those people whose needs are the greatest, where the adverse impact has been the most profound, and where we can use the powers we have to make a real difference. And in that sense, my starting point and the starting point of the member is the same. We might come to different conclusions about the practical implementation of some of those things, but I don't for a minute dissent from the underlying thrust of what she said this afternoon.
Susie Davies.
Diolch, Llywydd. Well, I think that's the same for all of us, First Minister. But let's just have a quick look at that disproportionate effect. We've got 72% of working mothers working fewer hours and cutting their earnings due to lack of childcare. And during lockdown, mothers were doing 35% of the number of uninterrupted work hours that the average father did. And I'm sure that those figures from the Chwarae State of the Nation report didn't really surprise you. But what about the fact that women in Wales are twice as likely as men to be key workers? Because if you look at those figures together, it's clear that a serious proportion of women key workers step back from work because of other COVID-driven demands on them. Now, regardless of the school hub provision, where attendance was lower than anticipated, and I'm sure you'll be asking why yourself in due course, it's women who have had to, and I mean had to, put their employers second. And as most of those key workers will be public sector workers, obviously there are private sector workers as well, what levers are at your disposal to ensure that their pay and promotion prospects are not compromised by their COVID period work record?
Well, I agree that the final point is an important one. I'm afraid I don't think we all do start from the same place. If we did, we wouldn't have a government that is still not prepared to guarantee that the £20 additional each week for people claiming universal credit is going to be continued beyond the end of March, would we? And that's a decision that will fall very disproportionately indeed on women and the work that they do in families. Nor is the furlough scheme based on the sort of principles that the member has just outlined. 7 in 10 requests for furlough turned down for working mothers. That's what the TUC found in the report that they have recently published. So I'm afraid it's not as easy as saying we all want to do the right thing, because not everybody seems to me to be in that position. I agree, however, with the final thing that Susie Davies said, that there will be things that we may be able to do as people return to work beyond coronavirus, and certainly in the public services, where people have gaps in their employment because they have had to deal with the many different demands that coronavirus has placed on them, that they should not be disadvantaged into the long term because of the way in which they have had to make decisions to deal with the many pressures that devolve on them during a crisis.
Davies.
First Minister, as you said, so often it is women in the workplace who've been disproportionately at the front end of exposure to the pandemic. They work in retail and care and health and other public-facing roles disproportionately, and in low-paid or casual roles, where sometimes the unionised voice for the workforce can be regrettably weaker. Yet the pressure can be greater to turn up for work at all costs, including personal health and well-being, and the domestic pressures to put food on the table and pay the bills is also acute. So First Minister, as the vaccine rollout progresses, and we can hopefully anticipate more return in the weeks and months ahead to many workplaces, including non-essential retail and personal services and hospitality, where women are overrepresented once again in customer-facing roles, then what more can we do than we did last year to ensure that employers put in place every measure possible to protect their staff and customers at work, and that the UK Government and Welsh Government have the right measures in place to support those who have to withdraw from the workplace for COVID-related reasons, and not least that the UK Government does not cut that £20 a week from universal credit, because that will hammer women at work and at home too.
Well, Llywyd, I'm sure that Davies will recognise the actions that the Welsh Government has already taken to protect workforces where women are disproportionately represented. So our decision early on to make PPE available free in the social care sector was a really important guarantee that those workers knew they would have the protection that has provided. As you know, it's charged to care homes across our border, where we made the decision from the beginning that the protection of those workers was our top priority, in getting them the protection they need and getting it to them free was an investment by us in the well-being of that workforce, as is the continued scheme that we have to make sure that people are paid sick pay fully in the social care sector, so that they don't feel, as Iolanta said, obliged to come back to work when they know that it's not right for them to do so. And in the retail sphere, where again women are disproportionately part of the workforce, we announced in January that workplaces would have to carry out new risk assessments with higher standards to make sure that workplaces are safe against the new variant of the disease. And we were supported in doing so by employers here in Wales. And those higher standards, making sure that workplaces are properly protected and everything is done to make sure that workers and people who use those settings are kept safe, will continue to be at the forefront of everything that we do as a government during the rest of this calendar year, when coronavirus is still going to be part of our lives. And I'll say again, because I so much agree with you, Anca Davies, the thought that up to a third of working families in Wales could find themselves with £1,000 less to meet the needs of their families, people who, who use that money to do simple things like keep the lights on and keep food on the table. The thought that this government has kept those families waiting, not knowing what their position would be, it's genuine cruelty. I think if you can imagine living in those conditions and knowing that just in a few weeks' time, you wouldn't have that extra support, I think it's shameful. And I really, really hope that on the 3rd of March, the Chancellor will finally make good the distress that has caused to those families.
Question 4, Jenny Rathbone.
Thank you. What financial support has the Welsh Government provided for taxi drivers to help them through the pandemic?
Thank Jenny Rathbone for that. So during the pandemic, taxi drivers have been able to obtain financial support from the Economic Recovery Fund, including 4 rounds of discretionary grants. A further £1.1 million has been allocated for free PPE and cleaning products for drivers to help them protect themselves and passengers from COVID-19.
Thank you, First Minister. I'd like to pay tribute to the Unite Union for having highlighted the extent to which taxi drivers were suffering for being unable to qualify for the UK government grants. And I also to pay tribute to the Welsh Government for reaching out to taxi drivers and enabling to get some targeted compensation for the disappearance of most of their customers as a result of the pandemic restrictions. And I think it's an excellent example of how the government's used its limited resources to fill gaps in support to small businesses and freelancers available that's not available elsewhere. But I also want to pay tribute to the taxi drivers themselves, because as a result of these really quite small sums of money that you've made available to them, they decided to reciprocate by raising over £10,000 in Cardiff for 3 local food banks. And it was quite humbling to witness the handing over of a cheque at the Al Ichlas Centre in Adamstown, which has been providing weekly food parcels to people in desperate need for over a year. So I think...
Can you come to your question now, Jenny?
Yeah, thank you. So looking to the future and our need to ensure that we have a clean, decarbonised public transport system, what financial support could be made available to taxi drivers to enable them to upgrade their vehicles to the clean air standards that we're going to be requiring in the future, so that they'll be able to continue serving the communities they obviously have such regard for?
Well, so I thank Jenny Rathbone. I want to join her in paying tribute to the work of taxi drivers here in Cardiff, who've worked so hard to be able to support those food banks. She and I, and I'm sure many other members on this in the Senedd today, have significant numbers of taxi drivers who live in our constituencies, and the pandemic hit them really hard, really hard. I'm very glad that our discretionary funds particularly have had an impact on the sector. Cardiff Council, as of Friday last week, had approved over 2,700 discretionary grants to those with a stated occupation of taxi driver, worth over £5 million. And The latest round, the £30 million announced on the 5th of this month, will provide a further £2,000 grant for self-employed taxi drivers. The modernisation of the fleet is a real challenge for them. It's why we have been very glad to develop a number of green taxi pilot schemes in the Cardiff capital region, in Pembrokeshire and in Denbighshire, to allow drivers to use zero-emission vehicles on a free try-before-you-buy basis. 50 taxis being purchased, 30 days for a taxi driver to use them free of charge, in the hope that that will stimulate demand within the sector for the sort of transport that Jenny Rathbone has very long championed. We're looking as a government at options for grants, leasing arrangements, and so on, so that we can stimulate the appetite for that sort of provision. We'll be there to support the sector in that as well.
Question 5, Jane Bryant.
Diolch, Llywydd. What is the Welsh Government doing to encourage more women and girls to study and follow careers in science, technology, engineering and maths?
Llywydd, the Welsh Government actively supports all girls and young women in Wales to study STEM subjects and pursue careers in STEM. We provide annual funding to STEM organisations within the education sector, and this year the Welsh Government will support the International Women's Day event on gender equality in STEM subjects to be held here in Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen some remarkable work and achievements of scientists and engineers, from producing vaccines in record time to testing systems, identifying new variants, producing data analysis and the development of new medicines and protective equipment. The pandemic has highlighted the vital role of STEM. Amongst those achievements have been some amazing women leading. Dr. Moore, who led the effort to establish COVID testing in Wales, Dr. Hayhurst, who is the lead scientist on a new form of rapid testing, and of course Dr. Gillian Richardson, who leads our fantastic COVID vaccination programme in Wales, which is the quickest of all the UK nations. These women are leading in their fields, but sadly, we all know that women and girls are far less likely to pursue STEM subjects in school, and as such do not follow into these careers. The pandemic has elevated our scientists and engineers onto a public platform and highlighted how important their work is for all of us. How can we use this last year to promote STEM subjects to our young women and girls and make sure that we get more Dr. Moores, Dr. Hayhurst and Dr. Richardsons in the future?
Well, thank Jane Bryant for that, and agree with her about the outstanding quality of individuals we have here in Wales as role models for young women thinking of careers in STEM subjects. And there's been some good progress in recent times. More girls and boys now study biology, physics and chemistry in Wales at GCSE level, and over half of our nearly 20,000 STEM apprenticeships in Wales are now taken up by young women rather than young men. So there are some breakthroughs that are happening. Role models are really important in that. The Women in STEM board that we have here in Wales, it met last October. It was attended by our colleagues Jane Hutt and Kirsty Williams to make clear the Welsh Government's support for the leadership of women in those subjects here in Wales and in those jobs that Jane Bryant highlighted, the way in which they can inspire others to follow in their footsteps. And I know that Jane Bryant will be interested that at the start of March, Careers Wales is holding an event very close to her part of the world, designed specifically to try to attract young women into the jobs in semiconductor professions and so on that are clustered around the southeast of Wales. And we're persuading young women to think of those jobs as their futures is absolutely part of the way in which that event is being organised.
Laura Jones.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I'm 42 now and had a couple of friends, strong-willed ladies, who broke the mould all those many, many moons ago when I was younger, and had glittering careers as engineers in a very, very male-dominated environment. It was virtually unheard of when I was younger. The situation, as has been outlined just now, has got an awful lot better. but it still has a long way to go to be how it should be. These are vital areas that we need future generations of all genders to excel at now, making it particularly more accessible for women, obviously, and women to be encouraged to sign up to. As you've outlined, the take-up for apprenticeships has got better, but it still has a long way to go. But career advice in schools tends to guide women towards apprenticeships that are in sectors where pay is less than those dominated by men. So what is the Welsh Government doing to tackle the gender imbalance in career advice in schools, and how are you working with the Fair Work Commission to stop the perpetuation of gender equality and to meet the equality objectives that your government has set? Thank you.
Well, so the event that I referred to in answering Jane Bryant's question is an event that will be run by the Career Service. So I would be very disappointed if it were the case that the Career Service is actively continuing stereotypical directions for young men or young women in the workplace. And I'm sure that that is not the intention of the service. It's an uphill battle, as the member will know. I agree with her, there's far more that needs to be done. I have a young grandson, and you have to work really hard to make sure that you don't end up just buying things that are pushed at us all as being the right things for young boys to have, rather than offering a more rounded idea of what life could be like. And that is certainly true for young women who have got all of those things pushed at them by the commercial world and so on. So the Welsh Government puts its shoulder to the wheel in the opposite direction, using the services that we have, and the many people who are there in private businesses as well as in the public service who want to make sure that that wider range of opportunities is positively promoted to young women and girls entering the workplace. We do it in a world that still has some pretty deep-seated conventional attitudes and so on, but that just means that that work is all the more necessary.
Cwestiwn 6, Helen Mary Jones. Oh, I'm not hearing Helen Mary's question.
I'm sorry, Llywydd, I think my microphone was in the incorrect position.
Yeah, it was on top of your head.
Clearly the incorrect position, I do apologise.
Carry on.
Will the First Minister make a statement on the vaccination rollout in the Mid and West region?
So thank the member for that question. They're currently being administered in 260 sites in the health boards which cover Mid and West Wales. We remain on track in all parts of Wales to deliver the milestones set out in our national vaccination strategy. In the coming days, we will exceed 1 million doses of vaccine delivered here in Wales.
And thank the First Minister for his answer, and I know that we're all very impressed by the amazing work that's gone into delivering the vaccination programme. But the First Minister will be aware that the families and friends of people with learning disabilities living in residential settings continue to be very concerned about the fact that those people they care about so much have not yet been prioritised. I've personally lost count of the number of representations I've received, from Llanelli to Powys, from Pembrokeshire to Penllyn, from families who are concerned. And given that MenCab estimate that there are only about 3,500 people in that category of learning disabled people who live in residential settings, I was encouraged to hear the Health Minister, Vaughan Gethin, on ITV saying last night that there may be guidance available in a day or two to enable the Welsh Government to provide those vaccines. Now, if this is able to go ahead, can I ask the First Minister if he and the Health Minister will place a priority on learning disabled people within Priority Group 6? The local health board tells me that that priority group is very large indeed, and I'm sure it would be a huge reassurance to those families and friends if the First Minister and his Health Minister were able to prioritise learning disabled people within Priority 6, if indeed they are to be included in that priority.
Well, so we thank Helen Mary Jones for that important supplementary question, and I think there is some good news coming from those families who are absolutely understandably concerned. I've seen the advice which the Minister will consider today on this matter in relation to prioritisation of Group 6. Helen Mary Jones will know that the JCVI, in the broad category of number 6, is underlying health conditions, and within that, the JCVI identifies people with severe and profound learning disabilities. But the advice that I've seen going to the Minister advocates an inclusive approach, where the approach less on gatekeeping than on ensuring that nobody entitled to vaccination is missed out. So the proposal is to use GP registers of people with a learning disability as the basis of identifying eligible individuals, and that should be supplemented by professional judgment and wider local knowledge held, for example, by third sector organisations or by local authorities. And the advice goes beyond simple identification to creating the right conditions for people with learning disability to be able to come forward comfortably, to feel at ease in receiving vaccination, and thus to maximise take-up. So the Minister will be considering that advice today, but I hope the member is reassured that the approach that it takes is not one in which we take severe and profound as a definition designed to minimise the number of people who can come through in that group, but to take a more inclusive approach, making sure that nobody who is entitled misses out. That is the approach we will want to take in Wales. And so maybe I should just say that the fact that we have GP registers of people with a learning disability, of course, is due to a very early decision made in the very first term of devolution, when David Melding brought forward a proposition for an annual health check for people with learning disabilities, supported around the chamber at the time. And as a result, we have these registers and are able now to use them, put them to good work to make sure that people with learning disabilities are able to be vaccinated in line with that Group 6 priority.
Angela Burns.
Diolch, Claude. First Minister, that's really good news on the learning disability issue. Are you able to offer equally good news for unpaid carers? Because, you know, my inbox, and I'm sure every other Senedd member's inbox, is absolutely full of people who are unpaid carers, desperate to have a vaccine, because if they get sick, the people who need their help, the elderly relative or the disabled child, whoever it may be, you know, doesn't have anyone else to look after them. And, you know, I note with the JVCI that they do talk about the whole caring situation, and they do have an addendum, and it says other groups at higher risk, including those who are in receipt of a carer's allowance or those who are the main carer of an elderly or disabled person whose welfare may be at risk if the carer falls ill, should also be offered vaccination alongside the priority groups. And, you know, there's a number of instances where either you or the Health Minister has said, you know, yes, the decision's coming, it's going to happen, and then it's been put off. No, we're waiting to see what the JVCI say. They already say that. So are you able to offer the same kind of hope to those unpaid carers who are so desperate and so worried over this issue?
Well, I don't recognise what the member says about decisions made and then delayed. We have said all along we will follow the JCVI advice, and that includes including unpaid carers within priority group 6. Alongside the advice we will publish on people with learning disabilities, we will publish this week the definitions that we will use to make sure that unpaid carers are able to come forward and be vaccinated as part of that group. It cannot be, as the member will understand, a simple self-certification. Otherwise, anybody would be able to walk through the door and get vaccinated on their own say-so. All 4 governments in the UK are agreed that we cannot do that. We therefore do have to use definitions to make sure that the right people are prioritised, and we're trying to do that on an aligned basis across the UK to make sure that those definitions are common between us. We'll publish the detailed guidance on that this week, and I'm very keen indeed, of course, that people who are unpaid carers get the vaccination as fast as possible because of the enormously valuable work they do and the vulnerability of those people who rely on their care.
Question 7, Lynn Neagle.
Will the First Minister make a statement on Welsh Government support for children and young people learning at home?
So getting children and young people back into school remains our top priority. A range of measures to support remote learning include additional support for practitioners, significant investment in devices, support for learners with additional needs, and the 29 million Recruit, Recover and Raise Standards programme.
Thank you, First Minister, and it was absolutely fantastic to see our youngest children going back to school yesterday. And unlike Andrew R.T. Davies and it seems Boris Johnson, I think it's really important that governments should follow their own scientific advice, which means that our children in Wales will be learning at home for a longer period as we manage that return to school safely. With this in mind, and given the recognition that there's been from the Education Policy Institute about the pace, and very welcome pace with which Welsh Government has got digital support out there to families, what further investment is planned to ensure that all children and young people can learn at home for the period that we now hope will be as short as possible?
Well, so with thank Lynn Neagle for that, and thank her for the work that she and her committee have carried out in support of returning children and young people to face-to-face learning as quickly but as safely as we need to. And I've seen her letter to the Education Minister of earlier this month, which I think sets out very fairly indeed the balance that has to be there between the urgency of the need to get those young people back into education, but always doing so in line with the best scientific advice to keep them and those who look after them in that setting safe from this deadly disease. Thank the member for what she has said about investment in the Hub Ed Tech programme. We're very lucky, Llywydd, I think, that when coronavirus hit, we'd already had nearly £100 million worth of investment in Hub. It genuinely is, you know, a global leading set of resources that we've been able to mobilise for young people here in Wales. And as Lynn Neagle will know, earlier this month, the Education Minister decided to invest a further £15 million in education technology in schools next year, and that is very much focused on ensuring that there are devices available for young people who need them, but also that there is connectivity for digitally excluded learners. And the £15 million that we were able to announce just a few days ago now means we can be sure that we can support those learners right through to the end of this academic year.
Ac yn ola, cwestiwn 8, Llyr Griffith.
Finally, question 8, Llyr Griffith. Thank you, Llywydd. Will the First Minister make a statement on the use of the Welsh language in Berwyn Prison, Wrexham? Thank you very much, Llywydd. The Minister for Mental Health, Wellbeing and the Welsh Language wrote to the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Ministry for Justice on the 16th of February to express concern about the allegations made about the experiences of Welsh speakers at Berwyn Prison and to seek clarity on the timescale for implementing changes to improve the situation. You will be aware that Berwyn Prison has been harshly criticised by the Independent Monitoring Board last year for failing to provide for Welsh-speaking prisoners and had denied certain rights to those prisoners because they were Welsh-speaking. Now, 6 months later, the prison has confirmed that they don't even know how many of their own staff are able to communicate through the medium of Welsh. So how can they claim that they are securing the necessary provision? I'm not sure. And there's been a serious allegation too, and I'm sure you'll be aware of this, that one prisoner had suffered an attack because of the coverage given to his case in the media in relation to the Welsh language. Now, this whole situation highlights a fundamental failure in meeting the rights of Welsh speakers. I know that prisons are not devolved, but elements to the Welsh language are, and this is happening in Wales. So there are more Welsh speakers in prisons outside Wales than there are in Berwyn prison, which proves to me that the original pledge that Berwyn would help to meet the needs of Wales was completely misleading. So I would encourage you in the strongest possible terms to ensure that this situation changes. And the fundamental question is, why are we still seeing Welsh speakers being treated second-class citizens here in Wales? Llywydd, I'd like to thank Llyr Griffith for those supplementary questions. It is entirely unacceptable to me if people in Berwyn are not being treated according to the laws that we have in place here in Wales. And I have seen the annual report of the Independent Monitoring Board on the Berwyn, which does raise concerns about the use of the Welsh language within the prison. And that's why Eluned Morgan has written to the UK government seeking assurances that the Welsh language scheme at Berwyn is being implemented. Now, I'm sure that Llyr Griffith will be aware that the Welsh Language Commissioner has a meeting on the 2nd of March with representatives of Berwyn Prison to discuss this very issue. The authorities in the Berwyn Prison have outlined steps that they're taking to ensure that the rights to use the Welsh languages are supported. We now need to take those steps being taken. We don't just want to see them on paper, but we want to see them having an impact on the lives of those in the prison, as Llyr Griffith has suggested this afternoon. Thank you, First Minister. The next item is the business statement.